Good morning, everyone. My name is Sasha Toperich, and I am the Senior Executive Vice President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. It is my distinguished pleasure to welcome you all today. TLN Energy Program that stands on several strong pillars. We co-organize the annual Eastern Mediterranean Energy Summit in partnership with Somokosai in Greece. We launched a discussion on a by-the-book approach to maritime disputes, advocating for cooperation and peace building over fueling tensions in the East Med. This dialogue began with our publication, Maritime Disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, The Way Forward, by Dr. Ruudi Baroudi, a panelist here today. The book is now available in 4 foreign languages besides English. TLN has been represented in various energy groups, such as SG26, a group on the sideline of the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. Our moderator today, TLN Vice President General Mike Barbero, was recently named chairman of TerraScale, a clean infrastructure and energy company in the United States. These developments, among others, are highlighted in our quarterly energy newsletter that you can access by visiting us at www.transatlantic.org. We host almost monthly webinars dedicated to important energy issues. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss cutting-edge developments in the energy industry and what it will take to transform and modernize digital infrastructure around the world. We also have distinct pleasure to hear recorded remarks from Congressman Ruben Gallego, U.S. Representative from Arizona. As a member of Armed Service and Natural Resource Committees, Congressman Gallego has been at the forefront of energy and security issues. Congressman, we thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all distinguished panelists who are with us, and to General Mike Barbero for taking a leading role in creating our event today. With that, General Barbero, the baton and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sasha, and thanks to the Transatlantic Leadership Network for sponsoring this event. This is the kickoff of our initiative on climate, energy, and security, and we're excited to have this event today, and with a very distinguished panel. And I believe Sasha framed the issue perfectly, but we're left with the question, what does the future hold? And how do we get to a transition to a green energy and decarbonization, given that we're on given our current status and current we have a distinguished panel today, as Sasha said. The Keynote pre-recorded video, we're very fortunate to have Representative Ruben Gallego from the Arizona State University. He'll be followed in order by other distinguished panelists, which I'll introduce individually. First of all, Dr. Ruben Gallego as I said, represents the 7th District of Arizona since 2014. He is the American success story. He's a son of immigrants, first in his family to attend college, and he graduated from Harvard University. As a Marine, he deployed to Iraq in 2005 as a line infantryman and saw some very tough fighting. His rifle company lost 22 Marines in 8 months of combat, so he's a tested veteran. And as you will hear this morning, Congressman Gallego serves in Congress at the intersection of security and energy. So he's a perfect leader to kick off today's event. And now, in his pre-recorded remarks, I'll hand it off to our distinguished keynote speaker, Representative Ruben Gallego.
Hi, I'm Ruben Gallego, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but thank you to the Transatlantic Leadership Network for letting me partake and be your keynote speaker. I serve on the Natural Resources Committee and on the Armed Services Committee, so I am actually at the intersection when it comes to energy, climate, and security. It's been a very interesting time here in the United States where we've actually seen the true effects of climate change and the danger it possesses. Back in 2015, our Defense Department actually declared it as the #1 threat to our forces, both here in the United States and deployed. You only have to see what happened, for example, in Tyndall Air Force Base in 2018, Or recently in Texas, where we just had a deep freeze that affected the full energy grid of Texas and nearly shut down many of our military and armed service bases in Texas. Not only that, but we understand too that energy independence is just as important as stopping climate change. Energy independence in the right hands can really make a country quite prosperous, or energy dependence can make a country either very frail or potentially at the whim of a country. This is why in the 2021 NDAA, I introduced legislation to close all the loopholes that were still left in the Nord Stream pipeline, something that I think is very important in terms of keeping energy independence in Western Europe, and at the same time allowing Ukraine not to be squeezed by more and more efforts of Russian maligned influence. And lastly, I am now the chairman of the independent organization called the Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee. And in that area, we are really exploring the kind of gray zone conflict that happens around energy infrastructure. And with good energy independence based on renewable energy with redundancy and resilience, we know that countries like Russia really can't use their information warfare system to hold us or other countries hostage. So, we have an opportunity in the Western world to really both do two things. Number one, turn the tide on climate change. Number two, really create a independent and resilient energy network that will not be held hostage by petrostates such as Russia. So thank you for your time. I hope to see you soon in real life, and I can't wait to hear about the topics and conversations you had today.
Thank you, Representative Gallego, and for your staff for participating and kicking us off today. I think the Congressman's remarks perfectly captured the issues and framed our discussion for this morning. As I said, we have a distinguished panel this morning, and led off by Dr. Rudy Baroudi. And Dr. Baroudi has more than 40 years of international public and private sector experience in the fields of oil and gas and petrochemicals, power energy sector reform, energy security, environment, carbon trading mechanisms, privatization, and infrastructure. His international experience includes projects and program development in the World Bank, the IMF, the European Commission, and many other international organizations, affecting areas such as the United States, the Middle East, Central Asia, Japan, and Europe. He's done extensive work in energy, security, economic development, and industrial programs. And he joins us today from Beirut. So without further ado, Dr. Baroudi, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much, General, for the nice introduction. And I want to thank Congressman for his fantastic brief and the outlook for the climate, energy, and security. I want also to thank TLN for inviting me to share some of my thoughts. The title of our event today is very straightforward, but also very appropriate. It reminds us that climate, energy, and security issues are no longer just interconnected. They are, in fact, inseparable, and consequences of failure are existential. Therefore, the way forward for us as species is to address them as a single subject, and to do so in a spirit of peaceful dialogue and cooperation. The more we follow this approach, the more our efforts will be mutually reinforcing, and the greater impact we will have in this. If we do not, any advantage we gain will be temporarily. Any short-term savings we realize will be dwarfed by long-term losses, and any sense of security we develop will be false. Like Congressman said, if you want to know the consequences of failure, consider what happened in Texas last month, how one of America's biggest and richest states was brought to its knees by a few days of unusual weather. It is impossible to say whether that particular event was the result of climate change, but we do know for certainty that climate change is making such extreme weather more frequent. We also know that disaster was made much more severe precisely because Texas has sought to go its own way, refusing to either regulate its power sector or establish infrastructure standards in a manner that would have permitted it to receive help and assistance from the rest of the North American power grid. In a world of unchecked climate change, Texas scenario would become more common even when infrastructure has been hardened. So would countless other types of disasters, from mass crop failures to the permanent immersion of low-lying areas, both on coastlines and many miles inland. In such a future, for most people in most countries, the threat to lives and property will be many times greater than those posed by any foreign power. My own country, Lebanon, sits on the edge of the Euromed area, which is home to about 1 billion people. Already hundreds of millions of them lack sufficient access to water and electricity till today, while hundreds of millions more could be left jobless, either freezing or sweltering in the dark if a major weather event were to damage power lines and or gas pipeline. Luckily, we have encouraging news of late. Greater cooperation demands strong leadership. And in our era, the only country that can provide such leadership, in my opinion, remains the United States of America. The COVID-19 crisis has shown what happened when the United States fails or refuses to play that role. So the fact that the new administration of President Joe Biden has instantly rejoined the Paris Agreement is a major step in the right constructive direction. Even more importantly, President Biden has not only appointed a special presidential envoy for climate, but also demonstrated how committed he is by filling the post with former Secretary of State John Kerry, the man who signed the Paris Agreement on America's behalf back in 2016. Kerry also served in the Senate for almost 3 decades and is well liked both at home and abroad. In fact, there is probably no other individual in American political life who would bring more status and more influence and more gravitas to the task. This comes not a moment too soon. We cannot know exactly when Earth climate will reach the point of no return, but we do know that we have fallen behind the reductions agreed to in Paris. However, much time we have, therefore, we have none to waste. We also know that developing nations and emerging economies cannot make the necessary sacrifices unassisted. If these countries are to become full participants in the war against carbon emissions, wealthier nations must assist them, in particular by subsidizing the sustainable development of their power sector. For reasons both economic and technological, natural gas is expected to remain essential as a transition fuel for at least the next 2 decades. In many of the countries, they need more electricity to lift their population out of poverty, and we need them to generate it as cleanly as possible. Despite what appear to be plain facts, some voices still pretend that climate change is a hoax. Others reject the need for even the very concept of international cooperation. They argue that the affluent West owes nothing to the African and Asian countries whose resources have been pillaged, both during and since the colonial and imperial eras. Finally, what I can say is that the case for cooperation could not be clearer, even if the only motivator were enlightened self-interest. Because if we don't change course, if climate changes takes firm hold, and rising sea levels swamp the coast that are home to most of humanity. It won't just be societies of Black, brown, or poor people who will suffer. It will also be affluent whites of Europe and North Americans, too. People who are utterly dependent on steady supplies of electricity, constant flows of fruits and vegetables grown and harvested by someone else. Turn off the power in Liberia on New Year's Eve, and most people might not notice for days. Do the same in Canada or anywhere else, people will start dying within hours. Thank you, General.
Dr. Baroudi, thank you very much for your remarks. And given, I'd like to follow up with just one question before we move on to our other panelists. And I'd like just to highlight for the audience, we will go into a detailed and lengthy question and answer period at the end of our panelist presentations. But Dr. Baroudi, given your experience in the Euromed and Middle East, your extensive experience in the region, we see many of the countries in the region commit to and have plans for a conversion to a greener, non-petroleum-based economies. They are very lofty goals. And given that their economies are almost exclusively based on petrochemicals and oil and products and profits, are these goals realistic, and what do you see as the greatest challenges to our partners in the Middle East in making this conversion to greener and carbon-free economies?
Well, first of all, the Euromed on the southern part, they have abundant solar power, which have been developing, but in a shy way. This is one. Number two, all of the East Med, they are thriving now to extract gas from the East Med in order to assist them to put aside almost 19 coal power plants in the zone. You know that power plant is much more, against any environment, climate rules that exist around the world. So if we consider that they will continue with the solar for 2025, 2030, and hopefully they will be able to exploit their gas, they will definitely can bring down their pollution by 50% by 2030, 2035.
Thank you, Doctor. You know, one of the themes of today's discussion is how do we transition from our current way of doing things, energy systems, to a greener future. And hopefully the trend that you discussed, the shift to solar-based in the Middle East, will help that region make that transition much easier. Thank you, Dr. Baroudi, and we look forward to hearing your discussion as we get into the question and answer period. Our next panelist is a good friend, Dr. JAStanislaw. And Dr. Stanislaw is the founder of the advisory firm JAStanislaw Group, and he has a long history of advising boards of directors and institutions on strategic thinking, sustainability, and environmentally sound investment in energy of all forms and in technology. He currently serves on several international advisory boards. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and an adjunct professor at the Nicholas School at Duke University, where he is a member of the board of advisors for the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Dr. Stanislaw received a BA cum laude from Harvard College, an MA from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in economics from the University of Edinburgh. So he is a perfect panelist this morning to talk about where he sees the markets and commercial technology going in the future to lead us to a more resilient, energy resilient future. With that, Dr. Stanislaw, please. I think you need to unmute, Joe.
There we go. You're right. I didn't unmute.
There you
go. Thank you for that introduction, Mike. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate with this panel and the Transatlantic Leadership Network to be involved. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with them and with the other panelists. I go way back in this field. My hair is gray. It would have been naturally gray anyhow, but my hair is gray. I started in the field just as it was beginning, the field of energy in 1975. It didn't exist before 75. And when we started, we didn't talk about climate change. We talked about the environment and energy. And we talked about the importance of local technologies to help solve the energy challenges of the next decade into the next century. I wrote a study with my colleagues at Cambridge looking at energy in 2020. We're actually here right now. We wrote it in 1978, 79. It's amazing to think that I'd be here at that point in time. But the reality is you cannot solve climate change without addressing energy. And energy is one of the biggest challenges to climate change. And so addressing it together is most important. We have to consider the two together. In fact, energy is the source of everything, let's be honest. There's no economic growth without it. There's no water without it. There's no sanitation without it. It's the critical factor. Back in 1975, 78, through the early 80s, we talked about more and more energy being local. But if good local technologies developed, it became a global solution, so global became local, basically. The technologies didn't exist back in the 70s and the 80s. They were still in the infancy. One of the leaders in this whole area, which we didn't realize at the time, was a man called E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. His book was about not necessarily small, but appropriate technologies and the development of those technologies. They didn't exist when he wrote the book. And it's important to note that Schumacher was the chief economist for the UK National Coal Board, one of the biggest coal companies in the world. And he diverged from that large scale complex to think about appropriate sized technologies. So we sit here now and we think, wow, what's going on? The energy transition, called ET now by all the major corporations and smaller firms, used to be called a movie, ET, now it's energy transition. It all began in real earnest with John Brown at BP, with whom I worked very closely, when he actually relabeled BP Beyond Petroleum. Lord Brown was also too early. The technologies weren't quite ready then. Well, and I've been talking about ET, the transformation, the transition, before early 1990, and I've been talking about it ever since. We are here now. The technologies actually exist, and most of them are economic, and those that are not, these new technologies will become economic in the next 10, 20, 30 years without question. The conventional wisdom has changed as well. In the past, the conventional wisdom was, if we address climate change, we're going to limit economic growth. That conventional wisdom is totally off the mark. Conventional wisdom should read, if we do not, underline, if we do not address climate change, we'll limit economic growth. By addressing climate change, we'll make companies more sustainable, more profitable. We'll make the companies more survivable, and it's good for the planet. Those companies that focus on addressing the issue will find themselves in a better financial position to position themselves to be sustainable in the sense of keeping their staff employed and developing technologies more and more to solve and address future problems, basically. The corporate world jumped into this quite significantly about a decade ago. We didn't feel the impacts a lot, but we're beginning to feel them now. Look at the cost of all the major technologies, from solar to wind to batteries and others, how they plummeted over the past 10 years. That's a result of large companies and small companies both driving that drive towards sustainability. Every major company in the world has a new department in their strategy area called ET, Energy Transition. They're all trying to figure out where to position themselves. A lot of us don't think the big oil and gas companies are working on the energy transition. Well, they are doing it very quietly through their own technology research and their investments in new startups and new emerging companies in these technology spaces. I'm involved with a couple of private equity firms. One is in early stage technologies in wind technologies, with AI, with solar, with batteries, et cetera, and carbon capture. In each of these cases, our firm is a major, it's called institutional investor, but we have partners from all the major international oil and gas companies. What used to be called Statoil, Equinox, is driving this. Total is driving this. BP is driving this. And now more and more of the large US companies are jumping into the picture. But also what's significant is what I labeled in something I wrote years ago called the crazy technology entrepreneur. Those small startups in their garages working on technologies they think will be the solution to the world's problems and make themselves rich in the process. But also the drive is helping solve the planet's problems. These small companies are working on small scale technologies, from insulation to more efficient windows to different technologies. And each of these can be installed quickly and fast. For example, one company which we invested in is a hot water on demand with natural gas technology. This is a simple technology that you only use the hot water to the natural gas to heat hot water when you want to use it. Think about when you go to a hotel. It takes normally 3 to 4 minutes to get the hot water running. That's a lot of wasted water, a lot of wasted energy. And this technology has AI attached to it. It adapts to your use patterns, which means you use less energy water because it knows when you want to actually have hot water. Well, if you take what this company can do to a large apartment building where it is for 200 apartments or large commercial places and adapt it to all natural gas hot water heaters around the world, which is not going to happen, you would save multiple tens of gigatons of carbon just from changing how you heat your hot water. And this can be installed very quickly around the world and uses plumbers, electricians, etc. And it can happen very, very fast around the world. I'm a great buyer into, again, back to Schumacher, appropriate technology and small is beautiful. Local can solve a lot of our problems. But the others think differently. They think we should invest 20, 30, 50 billion dollars in large scale technologies. Those may come save the planet in 20 or 30 years time, but they do not happen quickly. Both have to happen and they are happening. So we have the big projects and smaller projects. The corporate world has been driving this and will drive this even more as we go forward, primarily because of what's happening in the United States today, which you'll hear about in a minute from Debra. Europe has been heavy in the bandwagon about getting off of carbon and carbon taxing. Also, they've been heavy on policies to drive towards the energy transition we're all going to face and see over the next 2 generations. And it will be 2 generations before it actually is completed. But now we have a change of administration in the United States, and the Biden policy changes are an accelerator to what's already happening in the corporate world. Important to have accelerators, and it is an accelerator. The impetus it has made in the past 2 months alone for corporate behavior and corporate feelings of we're doing the right thing is formidable. So we have a win-win-win taking place. And I think we're on the path to what will be a brighter economic future, a sustainable one, and a cleaner one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stanislaw, and thanks for those remarks and examples of this transition, remarkable transition that we're witnessing. You know, our demand for energy continues, and there's a variety, and especially as we move to a more data-driven world, there's a voracious appetite for data storage, and data centers. I've seen one estimate where the current amount of data centers consumes 1% of the world's energy for cooling and powering and things like that. So as we transition, given this reality of this appetite, this insatiable appetite for energy growth, do you see a transition that is possible without disrupting the markets, without having a negative impact on our economies and economic growth?
I see the transition, in case you're talking about data, storage of data. And by the way, Bitcoin is an enormous user of energy, tremendous user of energy. And it's usually, it's electricity, obviously. A lot of it's brown electricity. It's not clean electricity, by the way. But the transition should and can happen without major disruption. That's my new conventional wisdom. By addressing this with correct adaptation, with transition periods over time to those cleaner, sustainable fuels, it actually is an accelerant, excuse me, to economic growth and excuse me, and job creation and prosperity. So for me, it's all a win all the way around. The consumer wins. We use less electricity. The planet wins. Companies make money. And you have to make money to have a sustainable future. If you don't make money, you don't have money to invest in the new technologies. It's a virtuous cycle taking place. So I do not see it disruptive. I see it as very important to a sustainable future and very successful in doing so. And also what it helps is in what we're worried about now in the United States, but also globally, equity. Equity between generations and within societies and across societies. That's where Schumacher was going, and Small is Beautiful, to make it equitable from individual community to nation across the board. So I think it's really a positive factor that we've been ignoring far too long, but I think we bought into now.
Thank you, Dr. Stanislaw. I appreciate your insights into this area, where the market and the technologies are going. It's very encouraging. Our final panelist this morning is Debra Cagan. And Debra Cagan is a distinguished energy fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network, but she is also a member of the Global Studies Advisory Group at Johns Hopkins University and at the Krieger School. She's also a guest lecturer on energy and climate and a board member for the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. And she serves as a senior advisory for JAStanislaw, a nonprofit dedicated to developing high-tech education, training, and jobs in the former Soviet space. Ms. Cagan is a career State Department officer with over 30 years of domestic and international experience advancing U.S. national security interests. She has a long track record as a successful negotiator of arms control and proliferation matters, and has been a senior nuclear and security advisor at State. Ms. Cagan has been widely published on energy and security matters and has a BA and MA from the University of Iowa and completed additional postgraduate work at the University of Chicago towards her doctorate, where she was named the first ever woman fellow for the prestigious Armed Forces and Security Consortium. Dr. Cagan, Ms. Cagan, thank you very much for joining us this morning and discussing what are the required policies for us to transition to a greener, more resilient energy. With that, Ms. Cagan, please.
So I'm going to take a little bit different tack than my colleagues because I want to talk about the people and making certain that in our haste to move in this direction, we're not leaving anyone behind. And that's where I come into this policies. The congressman and my colleagues have spoken eloquently about energy security, what it means, where we need to go technologically, and but also we need to understand, as the congressman talked about, that energy is used as a political weapon to gouge, dissuade, and suppress countries and populations from their own aspirations. And countries like Russia have turned this into a very fine art. So energy security for me also means the ability to lessen dependence on other countries for one's economic and social well-being, and to ensure that no person is left behind in the rush to achieve a carbon-free world. So the difficulty with transitions are that they attempt to move both mountains and people, and fundamentally seek to gain alliances among skeptics, and that it will always look far better on paper than in reality. And so I think that we also have an obligation to change that dynamic. So getting from hydrocarbons to hydro and hydrogen will take more than words agreed to at international fora. So the one thing many of us here today understand intuitively is that we're not going to succeed without like-minded allies, both domestically and abroad. And as we understand that gaining that support cannot happen in our haste to achieve these lofty goals if we leave people behind who deserve to be more than an afterthought. So as we in the West move at light speed to tackle climate, we want to not forget society's poorest and most vulnerable, those that have been shut out of economic progress, education, and a living wage. And it falls disproportionately on women in these societies by having no or limited access to electricity. Today, an estimated 16% of the world's population, almost 1.2 billion people, still do not have access to electricity. Most are located in sub-Saharan Africa. Saving our vision of the planet must include these people. And we should not be surprised at the objections expressed by the millions of workers who are currently engaged in the US hydrocarbon industry. Indeed, the budgets of some states, including for education and healthcare, are almost entirely dependent on these hydrocarbon earnings. Well, some have promulgated simplistic, even I would say flippant answers, suggesting that they can, and I quote here, make solar panels instead. Such responses will not gain the essential support we need as a nation to move forward and succeed. There is a real and palpable fear among many as to what this new future means for them. How we engage and include all of these people, as Dr. Stanislaw said, how can we make sure they get the jobs and it's just not going to new technology firms and people who have PhDs in AI and the like? That is the only way we will keep them from being disenfranchised. And it will the only way to achieve real success. So what we need to do as we transition is that we have to create jobs and have this be more than a bumper sticker. There's been a lot of chatter in the 2 months of this new administration about how we're going to create tens of millions of new green energy jobs. The question I have is, if you talk about these people who are already heavily invested in the hydrocarbon sector, how do they become part of this? Right now, that's a bumper sticker. We have to make it be more realistic. And so what we mean by this is, how do we encourage public and private partnerships to develop everything, like from micro manufacturing, as my colleagues have said, to the technologies needed to achieve these goals? We need to make sure that these US workers see a future. We don't want to leave people behind, and we don't want to have them turn into climate skeptics because they're not part of the solution. So if we've learned anything from the economic devastation of this pandemic, it should be that we cannot depend on imports from a single source or nation for the well-being of our own economy. It might, again, be a great thing to say, let's move these workers to make solar panels, except that virtually all of the major solar panel components are made in China, as are many of the components for wind power generation. It would be a tragedy if, in the haste to achieve net zero, the United States transitions from an energy independent country, something only achieved in the past few years, to one dependent on unreliable partners for its future economy. So the question then is, how do we get from here to there? And what I want to talk about is my colleagues have talked about, is these technologies that some were considered science fiction even 5 years ago are now real and offer viable ways to reduce Earth's carbon footprint. And I'm not going to go into everything because it was mentioned, but some of them are, in addition to new nuclear technology, blue economy industries about hydrokinetic marine energy resources, tidal and wave technology, to name but a few, especially tidal and wave because it's geologically diverse and it's not as dependent on the weather as solar and wind. And these are all applications that can happen. But virtually every expert agrees that natural gas with a greatly reduced carbon footprint, as my colleague said about carbon capture technology, will be available, and some countries have it in their planning for the next 30 years. But the decline in emission numbers for many countries which transitioned from coal and other heavy emitters to gas have been substantial. And what I think is creating some of the morass, some of the anger, some of the pushback on the changes that are happening is that people are being told that we're going to just shut this down immediately, and then you're going to have to transition. And no one really understands when certain people, including Secretary Kerry in some of his statements, what does this mean for these countries who've invested heavily into gas and have brought down their heavy emissions? So these are things that we have to address. As our colleagues at the International Energy Agency have said, we are not going to achieve zero just from carbon offsets or wind farms alone. This has to be technology. Heavy industry will still need to mitigate, especially heavy industry involving steel and concrete, how to mitigate this. And this is this new technology that Dr. Stanislaw talked about decarbonization from these issues. And one of the ideas that I've been tossing around with Sasha and some of my other colleagues at TLN is the creation of innovation hubs spanning the broad range of climate solutions we've discussed here today. And I would posit locating these regionally in those places that would be hardest hit by the transition from the carbon economy. So perhaps we talk about setting up 10 innovation hubs, conglomeration of federal, state, and local governments, academic institutions, and commercial partners, where you bring in these people who have toiled in the hydrocarbon industry for decades, and you use their expertise, these workers' expertise of how you move on to the next step. It is a way of including and involving them and not making it look like we're going to leave them behind and just create new masses of unemployment in an age of high technology and AI. So a few brief words, and then I'll conclude on the international landscape and why words at Paris are often at odds with the actual deeds of some participating countries. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia account for 45% of all global liquid hydrocarbon production, almost half of which came from the US prior to COVID. Many US producers have put new wells on hold and cut production in response to the plunging prices of the past year. And while the US producers are not racing full steam ahead, positive words and affirmations about climate aside, many producing countries want to move quickly to embrace reopening the taps while prices are higher. The crude glut from the height of the pandemic is disappearing. Some estimate that inventories are decreasing at the steepest rate in 2 decades. Prices have similarly increased to pre-pandemic levels, and US production has been stymied by unforeseen, as it's been discussed, freezing weather throughout Texas and Louisiana. Within the OPEC Plus coalition, Russia is pushing hard for substantial increases. And therein lies the rub. We talk about climate change, and a lot of countries are making the right noises, but what they're actually doing belies anything they have said in Paris. So Russia's strategy is to be among the last ones standing as others leave the market, unable to extract profit amid falling crude prices. But unlike Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, for example, the former of which is already becoming a major player in the hydrogen market, Russia has made virtually no effort to develop a renewable energy industry. And so while others recognize the precipitous drop in renewable prices over the past year, and make that industry more financially attractive, Russian gas will always be cheaper. It is the hydrocarbon house upon which a substantial sector of the Russian economy is based. And I raise that because there is going to be this push-pull where, as we all know who've worked in the international sphere, what is said at these fora, what is committed to, frequently does not end up being achieved. And so I would argue that this is still an important component to watch, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Europe wants to go forward with, especially Germany, is not just a hazard to Ukraine. It is, in effect, underwriting the Russian economy for years to come to the detriment of the safety and security of the European continent. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Debra. You've very clearly highlighted the difficulty in transitioning and the impact on jobs, and there must be some sort of policies to bridge this gap between and help transition and ease the disruption to our workers in oil and gas today, as we move to a greener economy. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question before we move on to the larger Q&A period. Congressman Gallego mentioned Russia and talked about how it uses its oil and gas as a tool of foreign policy. He also said we cannot be held hostage to these actions. And you've mentioned Russia, and that it is still has failed to diversify its economy from a hydrocarbon-based economy, and they've taken no steps to move to a greener, more sustainable based economy. And you express the concerns that Russia will be the last man standing and will use this as a tool as long as it can. So given your unique experience at policy at the highest levels in both state and Department of Defense, what policies should the US and the West take to help move Russia from its current position and the current trajectory that it's placed itself on?
Well, I think the first thing is, as most of you are reading back and forth in the press, that with the outreach of the Biden administration to try to repair some of the damage from the Trump administration in terms of alliances, I think we have a tendency to go a little overboard here. Democracies disagree. Allies disagree. They do what's in their best national security interests. And I don't have this problem of telling Germany that going down this path is unwise. For example, out of all the gas that Russia plans on putting through Nord Stream 2 into Germany, Germany will probably only use about 12% of it. The rest of it will be shifted to other places in Europe, and Germany will get quite wealthy as being the upstream provider of this gas. So it is not necessarily a need as opposed to a money-making proposition. So I think I agree with the congressman. I agree with what Senator Shaheen and Senator Reich and Senator Cruz have said this past week, that this administration has to stand up and say what are going to be the new sanctions on this, because Russia doesn't stop unless they're made to stop. And Nord Stream 2 was put on hold for quite some time because of the very effective sanctions that occurred in the NDAA, as Congressman Gallego said. But if we're not willing to do this, and if we're willing to cut some sort of grand deal, Vladimir Putin will not see this as any reason to dissuade him from going where he's going. And the other piece of this, and I'll make this quick because it is, as you can see, I have passion about this, is Russia also has two other parallel gas lines that are part of Turkstream, one of which is already up and running, and it goes from Russia through Turkey, and it is designed to dominate the Balkans and Southeastern Europe as well. So I'll just put this out there. If we cannot stop these, 70% of all Russian hydrocarbon exports will be sold in the European market. And there is very little that is going to dissuade Vladimir Putin from thinking that's a great thing if we don't come together with our European allies to just say enough.
Thank you. I knew it would be a direct answer, and you provided. Thank you, Ms. Cagan. Dr. Baroudi, a question for you. We've talked a lot about what the developed world has done and should do and is doing to move us and change our energy position. But there's there's the developing world. In many cases that are resource rich, but they're still in a stage of development where green energy is in the distance. They need energy today as they develop themselves and their economies. So how do you see, what can we do to assist these developing countries on this path to a greener, sustainable, and more resilient energy? Dr. Baroudi. I think you're on mute still, Dr. Baroudi.
Voilà.
There we go.
Thank you for a very good question. The under they still need a lot of potable water, and in the zones that they don't have access to, they have in Africa plenty of solar. World leadership, the World Bank, the IMF has been doing a lot of assistance, a lot of work. In the Euromed, European Commission has done a tremendous amount of good work. They have been assisting since 1996, and they have developed plenty of solar and aeolian and hydro type water power jobs. Now, there was in 2011, 2012, a tremendous project called Desertec that runs across all North Africa that has been stopped due to political problems, the wars in Libya, the upheaval in Tunis. We need to get access, we need to assist and get these people access to reliable energy at a sustainable cost. Part of the COVID-19, we have seen that most of the industrial nations, they brought down their energy supply to almost 55% down. For example, just taking the airlines, the airline between March 2019 that was running almost 144,000 flight per day, just the commercial one, we are not talking about a private or military, it went down the year later due to COVID to almost 35,000. So it shows that the industrial nations, like Debra said, is using most of the big electricity and gas, and the developing nation still need a lot of assistance. The IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission can definitely make a nice push in order to assist them to have a leverage.
Thank you, Dr. Baroudi. I think we're having a few problems with your audio, but we got most of your discussion. Thank you. I'd like to ask Dr. Stanislaw, as we've highlighted this morning, this transition is going to take a private-public partnership. Do you see governments moving as quickly or as quickly as they should to keep up with what the markets and what the private sector is doing to transition? And if not, or if so, what are some of the best examples or what we should do as far as public policies to make sure that we stay on this glide path to a greener, more resilient future?
Thank you for the question. Important topic. I may deviate from your question to comment on some other things that mentioned, if I may, because it's appropriate to what you're just asking me now. I want to underline the importance of technology, as Debra has said and Rudy has said, and the importance of sectors we don't pay much attention to when we think about climate change. I mean, Debra highlights cement and steel, for example. You know, those two have been critical to economic development, industrialization process. We have to find ways to do those and decarbonize them in a serious way. Again, I mentioned some of the new startups I'm involved with. Some of the big investors are cement and steel, because those guys have to survive as an industry. So it's critical. These players are all getting very involved. I also want to underline the importance in the developing world. I'm very proud that we have a son whose whole business is rural solar in Africa. Phenomenal business, and it makes money. He just sent us something this morning, pictures of people installing a solar panel on their hut in the rural area, jumping with joy, because electrification is the future. It always has been the future. So we have to electrify in a decarbonized way. These technologies, which Schumacher talked about in the 70s, didn't exist, they now exist, bringing all the advantages to modern life to people in an equitable fashion. When I say solar, I'm in the state of Maine. One of the highest states in this country installing solar power is the state of Maine. It's a booming business because the technologies now work even here, basically. And they work in Siberia also, by the way. A lot of sunlight in Siberia, basically. For me, public partnerships, Mike, are sort of a result of the speed at which companies are moving. I was at an event in Greece a few years ago where all the heads of state around the Mediterranean were there, and I was chairing it. All the government officials sat in the front row. Behind them sat the companies. And I said there, you guys in the front row, you're the Secretary of Energy in your countries. If look behind you, if you don't move and make policies to help support what they're doing, you'll be out of office because they're actually doing it. You want to support them. So it becomes what technologies can be developed to say, I know what you're doing. I'm going to remove all the barriers to the speedy implementation. And some of those barriers I don't underline are people. When I went to high school, back in Ohio, where you're from, Mike, we had in high school shop class. We had mechanics class. We had electricity class, which they were tied to apprenticeship programs and unions. Now those are no longer in school. There's a shortage of plumbers, of electricians, basic skills that is required in every single energy industry, from oil and gas to electricity, to solar installation, to windmill installation, production, you name it. Basic good jobs to employ a lot. I'm not talking about the AI guys. You have those guys too, but this is really critical, really critical. So how do you help support the educational drive? How do you help support and accelerate the ability to install those new technologies quickly? Remove all the regulatory barriers. And there are a lot, and help drive the process. I have to plug my computer and my battery is going down. I'll be right back.
Okay, thanks. Again, a demonstration of how vital energy is to everyday life. Thanks, Dr. Stanislaw. And I'll just add from my own personal participation with a company called TerraScale, which is a green energy, green data center company, that, it takes public policy to make this happen, but this is a private-public enterprise, and the policies, as Ms. Cagan highlighted from this administration, are going to lead us there. But it's also very encouraging to see that private equity and investment, which is the oxygen for this transition, has also made that turn, and they're not tripping over themselves, but they are all in on investing on this transition to a green, more resilient future, which is a huge change, I think. So let me ask Dr. Baroudi, the other player we haven't mentioned who's very active in the region where your experience is China. And what do you see from China's activities in the region? Are they going to be a positive or a negative influence on this transition? And what should the West and US do to encourage China to support and move along this path of energy transition? Dr. Baroudi.
General, thank you for the question. China, for the last 20 years, they have been trying to expand their reach to wherever they can find oil and gas. They want to be part of it. They came to the Middle East, they came to Iraq, they went to Africa, and they would like to consume and put on the side whatever they can reach for their growth. Their growth, in their view, is 7 to 9%, and they are trying always to buy more of whatever they can need. Now, China, as Debra said, they are manufacturing solar power, wind turbines, and all. Now, do we really want to have this economy move there, or do we want to keep the economy in the US and Europe? All of these policy, I believe they have not been really defined yet with the OECD when they meet the ministers of finance or the ministers of foreign affairs or the leaders of the world, G7 plus. China, for the time being, has been an economy power growing. They have never had a war. They have never spent time and money on any war. They have just been inventing and investing in their own economy and their expansion. I would think that dialogue with them would have a fair trade balance. they should be anywhere that they want, and they should be a positive power, at least in the green transition from oil, gas to a cleaner climate. Now, China has taken certain restrictions. They have been trying to cope with closing down some of their most polluting plants. Is it enough? No, but I think if they are put into the same team that the new administration is going to go, they will probably try to play fair game and fair play to meet the COP and the climate goals of Paris of 2016.
Thank you, Doctor. And we'll come back to China, and I have another question on that in a minute. But first, I'd like to ask Ms. Cagan. You, as we've said, you served at the intersection of policy at both the State Department and DoD at the highest levels. Recently, the Department of Defense has issued a document which says climate change is now a threat to national security. My experience at the tactical level, you know, our U.S. forces, wherever we go, we're reliant on these fuel convoys, water convoys, moving resources around to inefficient production facilities that we have on each of our bases is a huge target and a huge concern. So I can understand that at the tactical level, but from a policy level, what can the Department of Defense do to address this national security threat of climate change? And I appreciate your thoughts on that, Ms. Cagan.
Thank you very much, General. The first thing is, I think when I woke up one morning and had my epiphany on energy, it was certainly probably decades later than Dr. Stanislaw and Dr. Baroudi. But I transitioned from looking at security being involved with militaries and war to energy. And it occurred, my waking moment was during a critical time in Afghanistan. And we had a commander whose name I shall refrain from mentioning, who actually came back to Washington with a request that we go to Iran to ask for some energy for our troops in Afghanistan. And after I fell out of my chair and recovered, I don't think I can repeat what my reaction was, because that would be impolitic, but it was my wake-up call that we are just not doing this business the right way. And of course we said, no, you know, using Iran as your 1-point safety for the energy needs of NATO forces in Afghanistan is probably imprudent and unwise. So I moved from there to looking at this, and not surprisingly, even during the Trump administration, the concept of energy independence for U.S. forces on a strategic level was there. There were offices within the Pentagon who were working on this. And some of this, I think, comes with what Dr. Stanislaw has been talking about, these technologies and micro technologies, is this whole concept of how do you enable a military to move and carry its own electricity, its own power sources. And I think, correct me, the panel that Ash Carter had initially set up during the Obama administration, working with Silicon Valley on some of these technologies, was very interesting. It fell by the wayside during the Trump administration, but they were coming up with these ideas. And I think even today, Paris Island, the Marine Corps' big base there, because it is so buffeted by weather patterns, it's in the middle of the hurricane zone. They have been doing some experimental technologies where some firms out of New Hampshire on how do you take yourself off that grid and still allow you to operate operationally. And I think the big wake-up call for the military was during the coup in Turkey, where the Turkish government shut off all power to the Incirlik Air Base. And then you had them working on generators, but that was the air base most responsible for flying flights over Syria. And you can only go a few days on that. So I think from a strategic view, technology development, public-private partnerships, between the Defense Department and these corporations to see how you can then, I don't want to, I'm looking at Dr. Stanislaw on this, but how you can carry your power sources on your backs as opposed to doing it. And I think that's the climate issue for the military, not whether a big tanker gets stuck blocking the entire Suez Canal. And I'll stop there because I see Dr. Stanislaw, and I think he has some brilliant ideas here.
I'm laughing at that tanker. I cannot believe that tanker was how it's sitting. Can I jump in real quick, Mike? I think, Debra, great point. The biggest funder and backer of new technology, a lot of it, sort of off the radar screen, has been the DoD. Tremendous with the private companies. In fact, I know from work they're doing, and Mike, you probably know about this, designing ways to make your uniform with solar fabric so that it cool you and heat you. I mean, most of the people who are killed in a lot of these wars are moving oil around, for crying out loud, which is terrible to think about in this day and age. Let me just jump in real quick, Mike, and something else. COVID, we talked about only slightly in this conversation. COVID may be the biggest driver to real change in this sector. I was involved with a company who I was on the board of. We were big solar panel producers in Germany. We then went to China and made a partnership to produce there and undermined our company in Germany because the costs were so low. COVID has changed the attitudes to supply chains and supply chain disruption. If you look at molding, most of that's been done in China with our molds, and they make it, the product, and ship it to us. That's now changing right now on just mold, extrusion molding, for example. It's changing on the supply chain of solar panels. There are more and more fabricators of fixed and mobile solar panels in this country right now than there were 10 years ago. That's going to change as well because of the whole view of supply chains. It's moving towards the local and security issues all of us have been emphasizing. So it's really happening. But more and more partnerships on the research side are critical. Those collaborative centers you talk about, Debra, be they in Youngstown, Ohio, or out west, those are critical, basically, and globally, tying those research partnerships together, because that's how the change is going to happen. Because each of those will be built in their local areas, and that's critical as well. You want to produce there too. And the economics are now saying that's going to happen with our new technologies of production, which allow the more local fabrication. Sorry to interrupt, Mike.
No, that's great. And we'll come back to this local production in our as we wrap up here. And for example, solar panels. We'll come back to, and I have a question for you, Dr. Stanislaw. But first, Dr. Baroudi. Dr. Stanislaw said that he sees COVID as a great driver of this transition. Do you see that in the Middle East and the region, that they are seeing COVID as impetus to transition, or they're just dealing with the COVID so overwhelming that it's a separate challenge? How do you see it? Do you agree from what you see in the Middle East that that's driving this region the same way?
Well, there is no question that the COVID-19 is no longer a Middle East. It's a global pandemic that shut down plenty of industries, traffic, transportation, food, services, movies, theaters. It has been a disaster for the whole world. And it gave the whole world some time to think, what is next? Where are we going? A year after COVID-19, we are still struggling now with rolling out, the vaccines around the world. It is going to be a transition. It is going to be what I would say, a hope for people who did not even think that they need green, solar to start thinking of them. If you consider now the Gulf, the GCC, they have started for the last 6-7 years of promoting and using and manufacturing for solar and green, even though the green and the solar are more expensive for them to manufacture or to produce than using their own oil and gas, which is basically taking out from the well at something like $2 per barrel or probably less. Today, in order to save the planet, we all have to pinch in, we all have to move in, and the new technologies, like you rightfully said, and Dr. Stanislaw said, the private firms that have assisted the DoD and the world researchers around the world, they are still going to be needed to bring us more and more into the technology and to save energy use. But definitely we have also to face that planes are still going to be using Jet A1. Some power plants are still going to be using gasoline or gas. The aromatics that we need in everyday's life, like Dr. Stanislaw said, whether it's environment, pumps, sewage, and all, we will still need, but we are still going to be using a lot of power and hydrogen mix that is going to be coming, like what our dear distinguished colleague Debra said. The hydrogen is going to be the baby for a real transition. We have so much waste that is coming out and so much hydrogen that could come out from this waste for the use of every village, every city around the world.
Thank you. It's a great perspective, and hopefully this tipping point where green energy is more efficient and cheaper than petrol will arrive sooner rather than later. One final question. We've talked about China, and we've talked about, Dr. Stanislaw talked about how we must have local production of green technologies, but the fact remains, China is the world's producer in solar panels. And Congressman Gallego talked about us not being held hostage to petrochemicals, but we can't be held hostage to green technology either. So, Dr. Stanislaw, how do you see this transition from China's dominance of production of some green technologies now? How do we even that out and make that more local, as you talked about?
I basically see it happening now, without question. I just mentioned that there's a company in Ohio that's become a huge fabricator of fixed and movable solar panels. It's because it's not because of labor costs changing. It's because of technology of how you make the production line to actually do it and lower their cost, and how you use materials. So all of these are being re-examined right now by people who have had supply chain problems. Supply chain problems have accelerated thinking about how we look at how we do things. And then you look at resources we have from empty warehouses, by the way, you can get for nothing. What helped make China's solar industry, and I was involved in it, they built warehouses for free for companies to build the panels. You can now buy state-of-the-art warehouses in multiple states in the Midwest for 3, 4, 10 cents on the dollar. That just dramatically lowers your cost, basically. And that is happening. And companies are seeing that. Why are they seeing it? Supply chain disruptions have caused them to look at that. And then if it hits one industry, you look at all industries. Where can I find my advantage as a company? And you're seeing that all across the manufacturing base, basically. And a lot of it's just simple parts and pieces, not just necessarily large scale things. So pure economics is coming into play as well. And then I want to underline, I think what's happening with the Biden administration, now Debra can advise better than I can, more needs to be done to be the accelerant for that. And those are reducing regulations to have things happen. Again, I want to underline helping with the workforce, to help the education program or the skills application program or apprenticeship programs. Those take only a year or two, by the way. You're not talking about 10 years, it's 1 or 2 years that people right out of high school or while they were in high school. So I think it's extremely important to underline all dimensions of the economic equation, which is both capital. And as you said, Mike, there's plenty of money now looking for this, plenty of money searching for a home. And then it becomes people, money, and policy, merge them all together. But I see now we have a moment to accelerate. I think the Biden administration offers that opportunity, particularly if they get this next package on infrastructure development in place. And they're emphasizing a lot of these key points, basically.
If I can just add one point here, General, about China, the supply chain and the like. The one caution I want to put out here is on rare earth mineral supply. And China's been rapidly dominating that market, even so much as buying ownership in most of the Australian mines on this. So one of the things going forward, a lot of these technologies are going to be dependent on rare earth minerals. And the United States, which was a leader in this in the 80s, is now sadly very far behind. And so this is one of these issues that we really need to look at, because some of these technologies are going to be very dependent on the supply of these. And again, we should not be dependent on China for how we get these and introduce them into our market.
Great comment, Ms. Cagan. Thank you. I would just like to thank everybody for participating today. Those of you who have tuned in online to watch this streaming event. I'd like to thank our participants. First, I'd like to thank the Transatlantic Leadership Network for starting this initiative on climate, energy, and security, and for sponsoring this program this morning. Thank you, Dr. Toperich, and for your team. Tremendous. This recording can be accessed on the TLN YouTube channel, and it'll also be a link in our TLN weekly email briefing. I encourage you to share it. And this is the first of many fora on this issue. I think Ms. Cagan used the term, this is a wake-up call, and we need to look no further than what happened recently in our state of Texas, that we must make this transition, and we must take on the challenges and seize the opportunities that our distinguished panel has discussed this morning. And finally, I'd like to thank our participants, the Honorable Ruben Gallego, Congressman from Arizona, for his remarks, and then the superb contributions by our panelists, Dr. Ruudi Baroudi from joining us from Beirut, Dr. JAStanislaw from the wilds of Maine, and Ms. Debra Cagan from my neighbor here in Arlington, Virginia. Thank you all. And thank you to everyone who's viewed this today and will view it in the future. This is, again, the first of many fora on this critical topic. Thank you, and this concludes today's event.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.